In the fall of 1958, revolutionaries loyal to Fidel Castro came down out of Cuba's remote Sierra Maestra Mountains. Their goal was to capture military bases controlled by the government of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. 5 years before, Castro had tried to overthrow the increasingly unpopular Cuban government and had failed. Now, as his fighters approached the cities of Santiago and Santa Clara, the future of Cuba hung in the balance. Would Batista's corrupt military dictatorship continue to control Cuba? Or would the country take a new direction under the leadership of the charismatic revolutionary Fidel Castro? In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed on the island of Cuba, claiming it for Spain. Spanish colonists soon followed Columbus and introduced the encomienda system, in which colonizers oppressed and exploited native laborers on large plantations. This harsh system of forced labor, along with European diseases, decimated the native population. With the indigenous people virtually wiped out, plantation owners began to import hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans as a new labor supply. Tobacco and coffee were successful crops, but Cuban agriculture really took off with the introduction of sugarcane.
The system was successful for those who owned land and owned people. So it was a system that was efficient, but only efficient in terms of the production of wealth for relatively few people.
Led by Simón Bolívar, Spanish colonies throughout Latin America began declaring their independence from Spain in the early 19th century. While Cuba remained under Spanish control, thousands of Cuban revolutionaries struggled for independence through the last third of the 19th century, inspired by patriots like José Martí. Martí fought for Cuban independence from Spain. In 1895, in a battle against Spanish forces, Martí died for the cause of Cuban freedom and became a symbol of liberty throughout Latin America. Martí was not only concerned with Spain, but with the increasingly powerful United States. President James Monroe had issued the Monroe Doctrine, which said that U.S., not European interests, should dominate the Western Hemisphere. By the late 19th century, the U.S. began to aggressively expand its influence overseas, and some political and business leaders set their sights on controlling Cuba. In the words of then U.S. Secretary of State James Blaine,
"That rich island is, though in the hands of Spain, a part of the American commercial system. If ever ceasing to be Spanish, Cuba must necessarily become American and not fall under any other European domination."
The United States and Spain, two imperial powers in the New World, were on a collision course, and in Cuba, they would finally clash. Amid the growing tension between Spain and the United States, President William McKinley sent an American battleship, the USS Maine, to Cuba in 1898. While docked in Havana Harbor in February of 1898, the Maine mysteriously exploded.
And so McKinley's sending of the Maine was both a provocation and, in the wake of the explosion, the excuse that the United States used to go to war with Spain. And once the United States defeated Spain, it became the occupier of Cuba.
Instead of annexing Cuba outright, in 1901, the United States Congress passed the Platt Amendment, giving the United States the right to intervene militarily in Cuba at any time to preserve its independence. It also enabled the U.S. to establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. As a condition of ending the formal United States occupation, In 1902, Cuba was forced to incorporate the Platt Amendment into its constitution. Ever since Columbus had arrived, Cuba had been the property of an imperial power. Control by distant Spain had been replaced with control by the nearby United States. Would Cuba ever achieve true independence and control over its own affairs? This question would largely be answered by the outcome of a struggle between two men, Fulgencio Batista and Fidel Castro. Fulgencio Batista was born in 1901, the son of sugar plantation workers. Batista joined the Cuban army and became a sergeant. In 1933, he helped overthrow a dictatorial and corrupt regime and became the new leader of Cuba. For the next 25 years, Batista would be either the president of Cuba or the power behind the president. Batista was well liked by the American government, which valued his strong support for U.S. business interests. But in time, Batista came to be deeply disliked by the majority of ordinary Cubans because of rampant corruption, harsh repression, and social and economic inequalities. Many felt that they and their country were being sold out and made subservient to foreign interests. By the time Fidel Castro was born in 1926, the Castro household was a wealthy one. His father had started as a poor Spanish immigrant and become a wealthy plantation owner. Castro understood early that he would lead a life of ease, while his barefooted classmates would live in grinding poverty. In their faces, he saw little hope for their or their country's future. In 1952, elections were scheduled for Cuba, and both Batista and Castro were candidates. Batista for president, Castro for legislator. But when polls indicated that Batista was sure to lose, he once again took matters into his own hands and seized power. With the elections canceled, instead of working for change from within the government, Castro now felt that his only chance to help his country was to overthrow Batista and drive out foreign influence once and for all. Although he did not declare himself a follower of Karl Marx or a communist at this time, Castro believed that Marx and Engels' theory of capitalist exploitation of the working class accurately described the situation in his homeland, and he began to think that their ideas of class struggle and revolution might apply to Cuba. Spurred to action, Castro and a small band of revolutionary activists took up arms to inspire a national revolt against Batista's government. On July 26, 1953, this group of about 120 men and women attacked the Moncada army barracks in Santiago, but were quickly defeated. Fidel Castro and his brother, Raul Castro, were among the lucky ones who were only captured and imprisoned. Others were tortured and executed. Castro, a trained lawyer, undertook his own legal defense. It consisted of a no-holds-barred attack on Batista, his corrupt government, and the social ills that continued to plague Cuba.
More than half of our productive land is in the hands of foreigners. How can Batista's presence and power be justified when he gained it against the will of the people, and by violating the laws of the Republic through the use of treachery and force? I do not fear prison, as I do not fear the fury of the miserable tyrant who took the lives of 70 of my comrades. It does not matter. History will absolve me.
Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but Batista, wishing to improve his public image, soon freed Castro and his associates. It would be a fateful mistake.
Castro's career as a revolutionary, like that of most revolutionaries, had ups and downs. At one point in his revolutionary career, he was exiled and had to take refuge in Mexico. There he met other aspiring revolutionaries, and in particular he met a doctor, Ernesto Guevara, who had also been deeply impressed at the injustice and the poverty of ordinary people in other parts of Latin America. And Guevara became one of the organizers in the guerrilla army Castro was building.
By late 1956, Castro and his guerrilla force were ready. Aboard the Granma, a 38-foot wooden yacht, 82 men set sail for Cuba. Just as with his disastrous 1953 attack, fate once again seemed to be against Castro. Within days of landing, most of his band was killed, captured, or forced to flee. But also, like before, Castro and his brother were lucky and escaped, along with Guevara. They met up in the mountains and began to regroup. Torture and executions by government forces sparked strong support for Castro. In addition to many poor Cubans, other segments of Cuban society turned against Batista.
Castro's support is from the middle class. He is a product of the middle class. He represents the middle class. His language is couched in the language of outrage of the middle class.
It's not only Castro and his few hundred men out in the provinces, but it's also businessmen in Havana who start to whisper, maybe this dictator's becoming too much of a liability for us. The United States, which has always been calling the shots in Cuba for the last 50 years, even the United States is now criticizing Batista. He must be on the way out.
This was a critical moment for Castro and for Cuba. Had he not begun to win popular support, his revolution would likely have failed once again. While perhaps not even Castro himself knew what kind of government he would install in Cuba if he won, one thing was for sure: it would not be dictated to by Spain or the United States. In 1958, Castro launched an effective guerrilla-style offensive against Batista. Even though they had superior arms and numbers, Batista's army fell back, and on New Year's Day 1959, Batista fled the country. Castro entered Havana in triumph and assumed control of Cuba in January 1959. In Castro's own words,
When I landed with 82 men on the beaches of Cuba, and people said we were mad and asked us why we thought we could win the war, we replied, because we have the people behind us. We can say, and it is with joy that we do so, that in the 4 centuries since our country was founded, this will be the first time that we are entirely free.
Castro named himself Prime Minister and immediately set about reforming his country in favor of the common people. He increased the wages of workers and limited the size of farms, effectively breaking up the huge U.S.-owned sugar holdings. He distributed this land to the peasants. Serious about righting what he saw as the wrongs in his country, Castro sent thousands of young volunteers into rural areas to teach Cuba's peasants to read. More than 700,000 newly literate Cubans wrote personally to Castro to express their thanks.
Fidel, you do not know with what happiness I am writing you, and the thanks I give you for having given me the opportunity to learn to read and write. Now no one will deceive me, and I will know the truth.
Castro brought medical care to Cubans who had none, much as he had helped them to read and write. Almost overnight, life in Cuba had tilted in favor of the common people. Most poor Cubans loved Castro. But that feeling was not unanimous. Many well-off Cubans, some whose property and land had been taken away and given to the poor, began to leave Cuba, with hundreds of thousands coming to the United States.
Castro presented himself as a champion of the Cuban people, as an enemy of dictatorship, and allowed the United States to back away from Batista, and made some overtures to try and establish some peaceful relations with the United States himself.